Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I would like to welcome you to our ninth module of the telecourse on the way of the psychonaut. And our topic for today is holotropic breathwork. Holotropic breathwork is a very powerful experiential method of self-exploration and psychotherapy that utilizes the self-healing potential of holotropic states of consciousness. You will remember that we talked about this holotropic states of consciousness as a very important subgroup of non-ordinary states of consciousness. And the characteristic was that they are healing, transformative, and even evolutionary. So this holotropic breathwork is a method in which we induce holotropic state of consciousness with very simple means. It's a combination of faster breathing, then powerful evocative music, and certain kind of releasing body work that we already talked about in a previous module. And this is also complemented then by painting of mandalas and by sharing in a small group. Now, what's also important to say is that the holotropic breathwork is based on a new kind of revolutionary conceptual framework, psychology, that emerged out of the work with psychedelics and then other ways of inducing holotropic states of consciousness. And it's radically different from what we know as psychology and psychotherapy used in the mainstream. So some of the major differences, and we already talked about some of them. One is the vastly expanded map of the psyche, including not just the postnatal biography, but also the perinatal and the transpersonal domain. The second one is the awareness of the fact that the roots of emotional psychosomatic problems reach, again, beyond childhood, beyond infancy, into the perinatal domain and the transpersonal domain. The third one would be that we discover new powerful mechanisms of healing and transformation that become available on these additional domains, the perinatal and the transpersonal domain. Another important element in it is that we replace technique of psychotherapy as we know them from various schools that don't have unanimity about how to work with clients. We replace it here by relying fully on the self-healing potential of the psyche. The next important characteristic of this new psychology is that we recognize spirituality as a very, very important and legitimate aspect of the psyche and also the universal scheme of things. And also the concept of consciousness is very different from what you find in traditional psychiatry, where it's believed that consciousness somehow emerges out of the complexity of the neurophysiological processes of the brain. And in this new psychology, consciousness is really a primary attribute of existence. The psyche is cosmic, anima mundi, as Jung called it, and our own consciousness is part of the cosmic consciousness of the anima mundi. And another interesting aspect of this new psychology is that we use archetypal astrology as a very important tool and a guide in working with holotropic states of consciousness. Now, I will start here by answering a question that many people ask in our workshops and also in the training, which is how did holotropic breathwork originate? How did you come up with that idea? So this goes back to the year 1973, where I decided to take a sabbatical. I got offers from several publishers to write 1 or 2 books on LSD, which was at that time was really in the center of attention, making headlines and so on. And I decided to take the contract from Viking Press, and it came with advanced royalties that made it possible for me to live a year and just focus on the writing. I went to a party in New York City, and there was Michael Murphy, a friend whom I met first in 1965 in Esalen during my first visit in the United States. And we talked, and I told him that I'm taking a sabbatical and that I want to write a book. And he said, Stan, if you want to write a book, why don't you come to Esalen? Esalen is a beautiful place to write. We'll give you a house and meals, the Esalen Lodge, and you can do workshops for us. It's going to be a trade. That was, of course, very, very excited. Esalen is a beautiful place. It's a narrow strip of land between the mountains and the Pacific Ocean on the coast between Carmel and San Luis Obispo. It has hot springs. It's old territory. It was the sacred ground of the Esalen Indians, which was a tribe who lived there. And it's just a stunning, stunning beauty. So we moved to Esalen, and I started doing workshops. And in the workshops, I was talking about my observations from psychedelic research, both in Prague and then in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, and talking about the implications of this work for psychology. But the participants in the workshops were not very happy with me. They said, well, it's great to hear about all these fantastic experiences, but can't we do something? Don't you have a little stash on the side? Now, of course, this was not possible to introduce psychedelics into the workshops at Esalen. I had no permission outside of Maryland itself, from the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. And so I started thinking about what could be done, because these complaints and these requests kept coming. And I remembered some observations from the work in Prague very, very early, when if we were doing sessions. In some of the sessions, people ended up in a wonderful place. They had a rebirth experience. They felt that they resolved a lot of issues in their life, that this is the beginning of a new chapter in their life, very much like what happened to Albert Hoffman in his first experience that we talked about. But after some other sessions, it was not so great. Something got opened up and didn't get quite resolved, or actually something new came up. And initially we thought this is how it has to be. We waited 10 days, which is the latency period. It took that time for the body to recharge and had the same kind of intensity of reaction to the next LSD session. And then we ran another session, and we hoped that it would end up better. And then something very interesting happened. There was a man having a session, the final stages, the drug was wearing off, and he really didn't feel well. He felt tremendously angry and had a strong pain in his shoulder. And he told me, I feel if I could get somehow through this pain, that I would feel better. He says, could you put some pressure on it? And so I put some pressure, and he said, not enough, more. So I, pressed more and more. Then my thumb was already bent, and he still wanted more. But then he started responding. He started growling. He started screaming. He started coughing. And we did this for a while. And he ended in a place where he was just absolutely relaxed and peaceful, no anger. And then a second interesting thing happened. This was a female patient this time. She was coming down from the session, the drug was wearing off, and she felt really miserable. She felt nauseated and very kind of sad, depressed, a lot of malaise. And so I came to her, and she said she had this very unpleasant feeling in her stomach. So I touched the stomach and pressed a little, and there was projectile vomiting that came out of her. And there were 2 more episodes of throwing up. And like within a couple of minutes, she was in a great shape. She was feeling wonderful. And so I realized there was a system there. And so from then on, every time when somebody was coming down from a session and the session was unresolved, I would ask what's happening in the body. And then I would do something to intensify that symptom and ask the patients to find some way of expressing what was behind that. And as we were doing it, repeatedly happened that the patient started actually spontaneously breathing faster. This is what is called saccadic breathing as a result of these body interventions. And they told me that the breathing brought them back into the session. The drug was already wearing off, and suddenly they were like under the full influence of the substance. So I realized that breathing can bring material from the unconscious. And so as I was thinking about what do we do in Esalen to give people some experiences, we started playing with the breathing and the music that we were using in the psychedelic sessions. Initially, the patients were in a circle facing their heads to the center, and we asked them to breathe faster and played music. And there was always somebody in the group who was very close to some unconscious material, and they started going into process, as we call it. And so at that point, we interrupted it, and we just did the kind of body work that I was doing in Prague. And then the other participants, as they were watching, they started reacting to the process of another participant. And in some instances, we actually ended with 3 people who were going through something very powerful. I was working with one, Christina with another, and then the participants in the group were taking care of the 3rd one, and one of us ended. We just then continued working with the remaining person. And then I was working in the garden and was lifting some heavy beams and threw off my back. Really, really significant pain. And we were in a situation where there was a workshop coming, 46 people, and people come to Esalen from all over the world. So there was no way of canceling it, and we didn't know what to do. And we talked about it, and then we finally said, well, why don't we let them pair them up and let them work with each other, and we'll just tell them what to do. And this session was such a success that we never did it differently. You know, not only had quite a few people in the group significant experiences, but they loved the role of sitters. They say, what a great privilege it was to be there in such an intimate situation with another person. And also the people who were the breathers said it was incredible to have somebody's undivided attention, you know, for a couple of hours. So we never did it differently. So this is how the form of the breathwork developed that we are using now, when people pair up, and then one session is a session where half of the group are breathers, and then they switch roles. So I will now go back to the breathwork itself. So we have 3 important components there. We have the faster breathing, we have the music, and then we have the body work. So if we look at the healing power of breath, you can look at the ancient cultures and the pre-industrial cultures, And we'll find out that they attributed tremendous significance to breath. The breathing, breath, played very important role in their mythology, in their philosophy, and also in their ritual and spiritual life. And they saw, all of them saw deep connection between the breath, the body, and nature. So that the breath somehow connected the external world, the nature, with our body, with the lungs, and then it created a response in the psyche, and also could take the experience all the way to the spiritual dimension. So the external world, our body, psyche, and spirit were all activated, all engaged with the faster breathing. Now, this also was reflected in the languages of many cultures. So, for example, in ancient India, the Sanskrit term prana means air and breath, but it also means the sacred essence of life. And in China, the same connection exists in relation to the word qi, which is also breath, air, but also the essence of life, the cosmic essence. In Greece, for example, there was the term pneuma or pneuma, which also was breath and air, but also, you know, the sacred essence of existence. And they also saw the connection between breath and the psyche. So, for example, the diaphragm, which is the largest breathing muscle, is called phren in the Greek language. And this also means mind. So, for example, if you say schizophrenia, it means split mind. Or if you say oligophrenia, it means the person is retarded. They have insufficient mind. In the Hebrew language, the term was ruach, which again was breath, air, but also the spirit of life. So in Genesis, we have a sentence where it says, Lord God made man, Adam, out of the ground, out of the soil, and breathed into him the living breath, made him a living being. Now in Latin, for example, we have spiritus for breath, but it also means spirit. Then if we go to Slavic languages, like in Russian, for example, breathing means dýchanie, and spirit means duch, and soul means dusha, something very similar in the Czech language. And then we can go to Hawaii, where we have the term ha, which again means spirit, but also wind and breath. So when we say the famous greeting aloha, it means the presence of the living spirit. And the opposite of it is haole, which means without spirit. And that was the name they started going or giving to foreigners since the visit of James Cook. It means people who lack the living spirit that they themselves felt in their own body, in their own mind. So again, in many cultures, breath was used to induce non-ordinary experiences. And many things can be done with breathing. It can be interrupted in some drastic way. For example, if some of the practices involved half choking, strangling the initiate, or using smoke to half choke them, or the Essenes were using submersion so that people experience half drowning, and it led to the second birth, the experience of death and rebirth. Some of the other practices were much more subtle. So a lot of it, for example, was developed in India, the science of breath. And there are many ways that it can be done. It can be done by both extremes, by slowing down breathing, by withholding breath or alternating those two. Or it could also be done by a very refined attention. You don't change the rhythm of the breathing, but you change the quality of your attention to the breathing. In Kundalini Yoga, for example, the meditations start by fast breathing, which is called Bhastrika, and then after maybe 10-15 minutes, then you sit and you deal with the experience that was activated by this. Now, in some other cultures, they use vocal performances that can change breathing and also induce non-ordinary states. So, for example, the Balinese monkey chant called Kechak, or the Eskimo throat music would do that. This multivocal chanting, for example, among the Tibetan Gyuto monks, or also the shamans in Mongolia and in Tuva do multivocal chanting. Buddha himself was doing Anapanasati, which is a practice of insight and awareness, and he used it in his own meditation practices that led to enlightenment, and he recommended that that systematic practice of this type of breathing can actually take you all the way to nirvana. Zen meditation also there's a lot of emphasis on breathing. Some of the yogic practices involve really rigorous control rather than just passive witnessing of the breathing. Now, in the West, in the materialistic science, breath is seen only as an extremely important, vitally important function, but it lost any kind of a sacred connotation. And actually both the psychological and the physical effects of breathing have been pathologized. So we know that many of those experiences that happen during breathwork would be seen as pathology, because they would be coming from those domain of the unconscious, the perinatal domain, the transpersonal domain, that the current model does not include. So when people have those experiences, it's attributed to some strange alien pathological process. Now, in terms of the physical impact, we have something in Western medicine that's called hyperventilation syndrome. And quite a few patients can start spontaneously breathing. It's very common, for example, in hysterical patients. And then they have strong emotional reaction and physical reaction. Now, if you read the handbooks of respiratory physiology, the hyperventilation syndrome is seen as a kind of a mandatory physiological reaction, something that has to happen when you breathe faster. The most famous manifestation of that is called tetany, the intense tension in the hands. And when we were practicing psychiatry, we were taught how to stop it by injection of Valium or Librium, or injection of intravenous calcium, putting a bag on the face of the patient, so that you accumulate carbon dioxide and change the alkaline reaction of the blood, and you wouldn't be satisfied until everything is again quiet. Now, we have now done this in close to 40,000 people, this holotropic breathwork session. And simply this is not true. There are many people who do not develop the carpopedal spasms, as it is called, the spasms of hands and legs, even where they are beginners. They might develop tensions in some other parts of the body as they are processing certain traumatic experiences, but it doesn't have to be in the hands and in the legs. And if you continue to breathe, it's building up to a certain culmination, and there's actually a profound relaxation. So it's a way of getting rid of a lot of tension if you keep this tetany and continue to breathe. Now, in our month-long sessions at SLM, we did a number of these sessions, about over 30. We experimented with different ways of changing consciousness by breathing. We invited some Tibetan lamas. We invited some people from the yoga tradition. And there are also quite a few people who are Western therapists who develop various ways of breathing. Now, the problem again is like with these schools of psychotherapy, that there is really no unanimity. So what you should do, what would be an effective way of changing your consciousness by breathing? I mentioned that it could be faster breathing, it could be withholding breath, it could be alternating those two. In pranayama, you would be breathing forcefully through the nostrils, and you would be alternating the nostrils. In Klaus Schulze method that was developed in Germany, you are supposed to do deep yogic breathing. In the original rebirthing, it was using sort of the tips of your lungs. So we have experimented with all these different methods, and then the question was, which of them do you choose? And we found out that it's really quite simple, that all you have to do is to breathe a little faster, a little deeper than usual, and then pay very special kind of attention. I think I mentioned in one of the earlier modules that we did a number of retreats with Jack Kornfield, his wonderful friend and great Vipassana teacher. And we combined holotropic breathwork with Vipassana meditation. And we found out that the best quality of attention in the breathwork is the Vipassana quality of attention, where you simply are there, you pay attention to what is happening, you experience it fully, and you let it go. So you're always prepared for the next experience to come. So what we do in the holotropic breathwork, we let people breathe a little faster, a little deeper. And then once they are in the process, they find their own way of working with the breath. Different people find their own methods. So even here we use the intelligence of the organism, of the psyche, to determine what's the best way of dealing with the trauma. So it becomes a ideal approach for that particular person. Then we look at the next element, which is the music. Again, music, like breath, has been used, for millennia in ritual and spiritual practice. There are many ways this was done. A lot of it was using percussion instruments of different kind, drumming, rattles, sticks. In some other practices, using gong, for example, or bells. There was, of course, so development of different musical instruments. There were use of trumpets or tubes, didgeridoo. Many of these indigenous instruments that can be used to produce very powerful trance-inducing music. It was actually found in laboratory research. People like Michael Harner with Joe Kamiya or Gielek and Neher, they took these drumming rhythms, which were empirically developed in native cultures, to the laboratory, and they found out that they have very powerful effect on the brain waves. So they developed drumming rhythms or acoustic rhythms in general that have the power to change consciousness, put us into a trance. Now there the archives of anthropologists are full of recordings that they did where they were in other countries doing some field work, which are extremely powerful rituals. They have also videos of them when you can see the dances that they do, or some other kind of rhythmic activities like what the Sufis do. You can hear the music, and it's used in the context of very powerful rituals, such as for example, the Navajo rituals, the deer dance of the Huichol Indians, music that's being used in the syncretistic religions like the Cuban Santeria or the Brazilian Umbanda or the Santo Daime. Those are very powerful rituals that combine music, instrumental music, chanting, and dance, or some form of body movement. There are Christian groups that use a lot of chanting and instrumental music. Some of them are, not necessarily mainstream groups. So for example, the Southern Baptist Church, the Pentecostal Church, the Revivalists, the Holy Ghost people, the snake handlers. They have rituals when they use music in a very powerful way of bringing people into a trance that can have healing impact on people. Now, so far I talked just about inducing general trance, but there are systems in which music or sound is used in a very specific way. So for example, in India, there is a link between different chakras and certain sound frequencies. And this is used, for example, in a system called Nada Yoga, the yoga of sound, in which it is possible to elicit quite specific responses using musical sequences. Or, for example, there is a whole category of Indian ragas which were developed to influence different body functions, like blood pressure, the function of the heart, and so on. There are some other, very interesting methods. For example, the multivocal chanting, but of the Gyuto Tibetan monks or the shamans in Tuva, in Mongolia, the Inuit Eskimo throat music. Those are very powerful, mind-altering performances that are using music and chant. Now, we were using music very systematically in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center in the psychedelic sessions. I actually started using music already in Prague, where I moved from the more psycholytic model, where the patients could have their eyes open for a significant part of the session and interact with me and the environment. And then I found out that it brought a lot of interesting observations, but it was really not the best possible approach if you were expecting therapeutic results. So towards the second half of my work in Prague, I moved to a situation where the patients kept the eyes closed, or they were wearing eye shades, and I introduced music, so that there was like a transition to the work that we then did at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, which was the psychedelic approach with high dosages, with headphones, music, and with eye shades. And then when we started doing, of course, the work with breath in SLN, again, it was the most logical thing to bring this music into that work. Now, what is the function of music in these non-ordinary states? It tends to activate the emotions. It seems to open the unconscious. It provides a certain carrying frequency that takes people through some of the blocks. It helps them to let go, to go with the flow of the breath and the music, or the effect of the psychedelic substances. When we were, for example, the early years, when you could not really create combined recordings, where we had to work with individual discs, we found out that as we were changing it, that many patients felt like they were sort of left hanging, until the next piece of music came, and they repeatedly were talking about it, how the music helped them to flow with the experience. Now, in the holotropic breath work, of course, the situation is different from psychedelic sessions. In psychedelic sessions, we typically work with individual patients, and then a male, female sitter or facilitator. And there we had a chance to choose the music so that it best supported the experience of the patient that we were working with. So, for example, when this was a very dramatic experience, where you could see sort of a lot of activity and maybe anger coming out, we would use some intense music with African drumming, for example. If it looked like the person was having very sensual, sexual experience, we could use something like Scheherazade. When it was a very peaceful episode, we could also adjust it accordingly. If we actually knew that the experience was in a certain country, in China or Africa, we could also bring in music that was close to the music of that culture, just to support that. Now, the holotropic breathwork sessions can be done individually, but it's very preferable to do it in groups. There's tremendous advantages. One advantage, of course, is the economy, that we can work with large number of people, large groups, with about one facilitator for 8 to 10 people in the group. And we use the sitters who can do a lot of the work. They can provide, a lot of the healing environment. So it's a much more effective way of working than doing individual sessions with the breath work. And then also you have the sharing groups, which can contribute, very important dimension. Now, in terms of the choice of the music, there are certain basic rules, but eventually each facilitator would develop his or her own favorite sets. And there's a certain basic idea how to structure the music for the session. You start with a kind of music that's activating, that's very alive. It's also reassuring. And then as the experience is getting stronger, then we move to rhythmic music, you know, drumming, things coming from native cultures, or some combination of these kinds of native rhythm and contemporary music. And then as it's culminating, we use something that we call breakthrough music, very powerful orchestra, maybe with a lot of voices in languages that people don't understand, or some really good soundtrack from a movie. And then as the session is kind of winding down, we do something that we call heart music, you know, very emotional. It's great to bring some feminine element, feminine voices to bring the session to a good closure. And then at the end, there is a very timeless kind of a flowing meditative music. We like to use recordings that don't have any words, that are not songs or other vocal elements, in languages that are easily to understand for the group. We use frequently human voices in the recordings, but this would be recordings where the human voice is just another instrument, but you don't get focused on the cognitive part, trying to understand what the message is, and get somehow programmed by it. We also prefer music that's done with natural instrument rather than you know, electronic music, techno music, and so on. This music, like music that was developed for trance induction in these native cultures, shamanic traditions, and so on, they really affect what the anthropologists call the primal mind, something that will have strong effect of people, whatever historical period it is, whatever country they are from, whatever race, whatever gender, whatever age. There's something really powerful that the human psyche would respond to on a very, very deep level. So those are the most common principles. We also try to stay away from some pieces of music that would bring very specific associations, like if you would play Overture Bizet to Overture to Carmen, everybody would sort of have the atmosphere of a bullfight and toreros and so on. Or if you bring in Wagner's or Mendelssohn Bartholdy's Wedding March, this is also a very, very specific input, unless it's your attention, you know, to create that kind of effect for some very specific reason in an individual session. But usually it's good to stay away from those kinds of pieces that would create very specific associations. Now we have the third element, which is the use of the releasing body work. That is done mostly, very, very seldom in the course of the session, but it used at the end of the session when something remains unresolved. Very much the way I used it in Prague for the psychedelic session. So we discussed some of the basic principles that you basically want to intensify what's happening in the body. You want to keep the tension in that part of the body, and then encourage the person that you're working with to find some way that they're spontaneously responding to that situation. And we continue doing it until we feel that the session was satisfactorily resolved and that it was good to end it for the day. Now, maybe I would say a few words about the hyperventilation syndrome, which is seen as manifestation of pathology, but I see it now as something that is a spontaneous healing impulse in the body. When the patients were doing it spontaneously, these were really unconscious attempts at healing, getting rid of something. And we should change certainly our practices to support it rather than use the common mechanisms that are used in medicine to stop these kinds of experiences. Now, in the breath work, it's really important to say that the tensions in the body can be released in two different ways. The first one is by expressing it in some movements, you know, in shaking and so on, in dancing movements and so on. And the other one is by keeping the tension. If tension develops, just keep breathing and until it culminates and it releases itself. This is a parallel to sports physiology, where you can do work in two different ways. You can do something that is called the isometric exercise, which means the length of the muscle remains the same, but the tension increases. Or you have the isotonic, where the tension is the same, but you know, there is a movement. Now, both of them are very effective way of getting rid of pent-up physical energy in the body. So holding for a long time what's been called tetany is actually an extremely relaxing, releasing practice that can bring very, very profound relaxation and stress reduction. So this is I think about the body work. There were different body maneuvers that were also used in the native practices. For example, if you watch the healing ceremony of the Kalahari Bushmen, when they do all-night dance and drumming, usually the men dancing and the women drumming, and they activate a certain kind of an energy in the group that they call Ntum, which translates as medicine. And then if you see the recording, they are passing this energy from one person to another as if it were contagious. And then they go through very intense reactions where you can see both. You can see a lot of activity, but you can also see sometimes extended periods of tension. And then as they work with each other, you can see them doing all kinds of maneuvers that resemble our body work. So something similar also in some of the Caribbean rituals, like in Umbanda, for example, where people end up in a process where the idea is that the deities take over, the orishas take over, and then as they are supporting this emotional and physical work, they also use a lot of physical interventions, so that these kinds of rituals look very much like what might happen in our workshop. So then we have the next element, which is the mandala drawing. The term mandala means a circle, or it means completion. And in the most general sense, you can use the term mandala for some kind of symmetrical, geometrical arrangement. For example, you could talk about a spider web as being a beautiful mandala, a stained glass window, or like a labyrinth in a Gothic cathedral. You can look at a shell, like a sand dollar, as being a beautiful mandala. Certainly the petals in many flowers, could be seen as mandalas. They can be painted, they can be drawn, or they can be danced in a ritual context. Now, in a more sophisticated form, the mandalas are used in the tantric branches of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. And there is a combination of two elements. There is a certain abstract tantric alphabet where you use simple geometrical forms. For example, a point, a line, a triangle, going up or going down or intersecting into a six-pointed star. There could be circles, there could be squares, there could be this little more complicated elements which are called gates that surround the mandalas. Lotus flowers would also belong there. And then this is combined with figurative compositions, where you see different deities or demonic presences. And these mandalas are used as teaching devices. Actually, painting mandalas is a tantric practice, or one of the practices, where the idea is that somebody who paints the mandala is coming from a certain state of consciousness. And those who then meditate on that mandala can use it as a bridge into a similar state of consciousness. So that it's like a transmission of one state to another through the means of the mandala. Something similar to a koan, which is used in Zen Buddhism, when you get a certain sentence that came from a certain state of consciousness, and you cannot really get the meaning of it until and unless you yourself would attain that state of consciousness. Now, there's also different ways of using mandalas, which came from Carl Gustav Jung, who became very, very interested in mandalas and also painted a lot of them in his Red Book. And he noticed that actually many of his patients, and I have seen it also in my own patients, towards the end of the therapeutic process, they start spontaneously drawing mandalas. Now, Jung's idea was that it's a really graphic expression of the grounding of the experience. That where the square would represent earth or grounding, and the circle represents the transcendental. So we are bringing the transcendental and you are grounding it. And Jung was pointing to the fact that this was used in many of the ancient architectures. For example, in the building of the ziggurat, or you find it in the medieval fountains, where there's a square base and then the round well. And many of these kinds of images are part of the alchemical symbolism, where you find the combination of the circle and the square. Now, there are many other cultures that are using mandalas other than the tantric traditions. For example, very sophisticated Navajo art, the sand paintings also have many mandalas in them. Or if you look at the Huichol Indian yarn paintings called Nierikas, they also frequently represent quite beautiful complex mandalas. Another area where you can find it is in Australia, the Australian Aborigines, who have bark paintings and frequently at the arrangement of the mandalas. Now, our own working with mandalas, as we were using it in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, came from Jane Callow. She was a music I mean, an art therapist. She worked first in some psychiatric hospitals in New Jersey, and she developed the work with mandalas as a diagnostic test originally, where she would take, for example, 50 patients who were depressed, 50 patients who were obsessive compulsive and so on, and took a piece of paper and made a circle of it using a plate, and then gave them some drawing, painting utensils, some pastels or magic markers or watercolors and so on, and asked them to just fill that circle in any way they wanted to. And then she was looking at the mandalas, trying to find out if there was anything that these mandalas of the patients who had the same clinical problem or very similar problem would have in common. And then when she joined our staff in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, she was doing it with our clients. She let them paint the mandala before, during, and after. And she was trying to find out if the mandala in some way predicted what the session would be like, or if certain kinds of sessions resulted in specific kinds of mandalas. So this was a very, very interesting material that she collected herself, and then she moved in a different direction when she left the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center and developed it actually as a personality test. Now, when we use the mandalas in the sharing group, we use it only as a report of the participant, what the session was like. It's a kind of a, if you want, right brain report that's a complement to the more left brain report when they give a verbal account of what happened to them. Now, in the work with the mandalas, we did not interpret or do not interpret for the same reason that I gave before when I talk about the different schools of psychology, which is that the same element would be interpreted very, very differently depending on the school that the particular therapist was trained in. And the symbols actually can mean many different things in different cultures. So, for example, I mentioned that there's a six-pointed star in Tantra, where it is something that you find at the fourth chakra, and it's a symbol of creation. There's a connection between Shiva and Shakti. In Kabbalah, for example, it's the six-pointed star of David represent the people moving towards God and God moving towards people. In the Gnostic tradition, parts of the triangle represent elements. For example, if it's pointing up and it's open, it's air. If it's pointing up and it's closed, it's fire. If it's pointing down and it's solid, it's earth. If it's open, it's water, and so on. And then the six-pointed star is like a synthesis of elements. Or if you take a symbol of a snake, for example, for Freud, it meant only one thing. It was always phallic. Now, in this kind of work and in Jungian psychology, there can be many, many different meanings of the snake depending on which archetypal domain they're coming from. So the snake in the Garden of Eden is not the same as the snake representing Kundalini, or the plumed serpent representing Quetzalcoatl, or the rainbow serpent representing or used by the Australian Aborigines. So now we describe the elements that go into holotropic breathwork, and I will now describe what the session looks like. So, for example, when we do a group with people who have never done it, which we usually do as at least a weekend. So let's say on Friday, I would give a general talk about the healing potential of non-ordinary state. We could explain what holotropic states of consciousness are, and try to take away the pathological connotation that it has in Western psychiatry. When people have perinatal experiences or transpersonal experiences, try to give people permission to go wherever they need to go. And then in the second half of this opening evening, we talk about what I call the nitty-gritty, give instructions, what the breathers will be doing, what the sitters would be doing, how we are going to communicate, what are some of the basic rules. And then people choose partners, and then we assign them to, those are usually big groups, so we assign them to smaller groups, and each of the smaller groups has specific facilitators. And then they spend a little time with the facilitators, so they connect and they get to know each other. Then we meet the next morning, which is usually Sunday, and I take them through a relaxation exercise where we go through different parts of the body, beginning with the feet and trying to relax them as much as possible, working with the image of mental image of light as we are really relaxing, bringing the image of light into the different parts of the body. And then when we get to the point that the body is as relaxed as it can be on that day, then the next suggestion is to pay attention to the mind, let go of any plans, any programs that people might have made for the session, what they would like to experience, what they would rather like to avoid, so that they go into the session with what the Zen Buddhists call the beginner's mind, as if they didn't know anything about the process, allowing themselves to be surprised by what's emerging from moment to moment, experiencing it. If there's anything that wants to express itself, let it express itself, and then be always open for the next experience to come. And then the final part of this preparation, we bring the attention to breath, at first connecting with the breath, making an exquisite connection with the breath without changing in any way the pace of the breathing. And then when they make the connection, then the suggestion is to make it a little faster, a little deeper than usual. It seems to help tying the inhalation and the exhalation into a kind of circle of breath, and staying with the attention on the breath and the body. And then we bring the music into the session. The instruction is just to be there with the eyes closed, paying attention to what is happening, allowing whatever wants to express itself. Now, for some people, the session continues in a way that they're actually progressively relaxing, that there's nothing sort of major happening in their body except the relaxation. They might have the feeling that their boundaries are merging, that they feel more connected with the group or even with the world, and they can start seeing lights, and they can go into a spiritual experience without really going through any kind of dramatic episodes. This is usually an exception that becomes more common when people do a lot of work, but it can happen even in the first session. There's many people who have actually difficulties with it. You would expect that they would welcome it, but they sort of listen to the other patients who are making sounds and moving, and they think that that's what should happen, that you should do some work rather than just sort of relaxing. So it's important before the session to tell people, if the process is taking them into this positive state, to trust it and to take it as a grace. It's a great way of starting the work with the breath, because you know what is possible, and you create some kind of a positive background for any challenges that might come in the future sessions. Now, for most people, tensions would develop in the body, but they are not necessarily the carpopedal spasms in the hands and the feet. Generally, we see that what you see in most instances is intensification of tension in the areas that people know from their everyday life as parts of the body where they respond in difficult situations, in stress and so on. For some people, it might be the neck or the shoulders or the stomach or the small of the back and so on. So typically it's the intensification of what they already know as their zones. We talked about psychosomatic diseases. One of the theories was about reactors, that people are gastric reactors, that they are back reactors and so on. So the release of problems in this work happens through temporary intensification. This is the opposite of what we are trying to do in psychiatry, which is suppress the symptom, make the person feel it less. We want people to feel it more until the intensity and the depth of the unconscious record matches the conscious experience, and then that symptom dissolves. It seems to disappear, and typically does not come back. Sometimes it might not be areas of the body that they are already aware of, but it can be something that was an issue in the past that seems to still have some leftovers in the body. For example, there was asthma in childhood or in adolescence, and it's not anymore, but somehow the pattern, the template is still there on a deeper level. So sometimes latent symptoms can manifest and then get completed. Now, in an ideal situation, people can do all the work by themselves. You just are there with the eyes closed, you breathe, and then these tensions develop, emotions come, depending on what the nature of the problem is. It could be sadness or anger, or it could be sort of sensual, sexual feelings. This would depend on the nature of the material that's gone. There could be images, reliving of memories in a very kind of a vivid way. So this could be all unfolding as you are breathing. It's reaching a certain culmination point, and then even if you continue breathing, then there's a quieting of the process. So it's almost like the material is coming in quanta. This is what we know from physics, that energy exists in certain quanta. So it's very interesting that the psyche brings a certain kind of a package, brings it to the surface, and then it's resolved, and then ideally end up in a relaxed situation. Now then, if this doesn't complete itself such a way that you are really deeply relaxed, you don't have any leftover emotions, then you just simply can go and paint the mandala after checking with the facilitators. Now then, if there is a leftover, then we do the body work that I already described. Now then, the question is what maybe one more thing that I should mention, which is we use also this nourishing, this supportive contact. If people are in a deeply regressed state, and it has to do with childlike helplessness, sense of abandonment, or it's just relived birth and they really look like a forlorn kind of newborn, then that's the situation where we actually use the nourishing physical contact, which would be holding the hand, or putting the hand on the forehead, or if people feel comfortable and they have a good connection of trust, it might end up in really full body support, the way Pauline McCrillick and Joyce Martin were doing it in London. Now, the role of the facilitators and the sitters is to cooperate so that they make it safe for everybody. you know, we tell people ahead of time that they can do everything on their back in a reclining position, but people will not listen necessarily. Sometimes somebody gets the idea that to get born, they have to go to the wall and possibly through the wall, and they start moving, and they would go into the place of somebody else. So the sitters and the facilitators cooperate, you know, to make it really safe for everybody. And another thing is taking people to the bathroom, waiting and bringing them back. If the sitter has to go to the bathroom, we ask them to bring one of us to be there to take care of that breather, so we don't have anybody in the room who is not covered. If we do that, if we would just leave the person alone, it tends to happen that this would be the time when they decide to travel, and they start moving very forcefully into the space of another person. Or even worse, that's the time when they sort of reach a memory of total abandonment in childhood, and now they want to find out that this time it's different. They open their eyes and they find out that in a big group of people, they're the only one who doesn't have anybody. Then you would get a reinforcement of the traumatic situation rather than corrective experience that we are going for. So those are the most important thing. The rest is by and large common sense. If people, you know, need a Kleenex, handing them a Kleenex. If they feel cold, you're giving them an extra blanket. If they are thirsty, giving them water and so on. So this is all done in cooperation, so that the whole group cooperates to create a really supportive and safe environment for everybody. And then after the mandalas are done, and you know, people had dinner, then we get together in small groups. If we have these large groups, for example, we had groups up to 300, 350. The largest in Moscow was 460 people with 70 facilitators. So we need a lot of small rooms. There are no limits to how many people can breathe together. It's actually very, very powerful. So many people in a non-ordinary state, and, you know, powerful music in the room. But then we need this intimacy of the small groups where they do the sharing. So the first evening, as they get together, they get to know who the facilitators are, and that those are the people with whom they then get together for the processing. And then we bring the mandalas there, and then people talk about their experiences, and they show their mandalas. Very frequently, the mandalas actually tell more than the narrative can tell. When we were doing breathwork at Estalen in our month-long workshops, we asked people to keep all the mandalas, and at the end of it, we gave everybody a space. They would lay out the mandalas, and they would tell what happened to them and relate it to the mandala. But the whole month, the mandalas would be put in such a way that each person would have a vertical column, and it was one look you could tell, you know, what happened to that person. Let's say it starts and the whole mandala is black, and then in the next one, you know, a little sort of light is coming into it, and then in the next one, colors, and then it starts looking like a volcano, and then at the end would be like the sun or the rainbow. So you get a pretty fast, you know, non-verbal idea what the person was through. We do the same in the training, where people collect the mandalas for something that would be 2 years or more, because they can choose their own pace in the training. And then again, towards the end of the training, they get space and time to share what happened to them. This is where I started, this is where I ended, and this is how it happened. Now, in the Freudian understanding, you should be able to fully understand any kind of product of your psyche by going back. This is a strictly deterministic system. So if you have a dream, you find that there are elements from childhood and maybe infancy, and there could be elements of what happened to you last month, what happened to you last week, what happened to you yesterday. And this should somehow determine what the dream would be about. So you should basically have everything that you need to really fully understand that dream. Now we see very frequently what Jung contributed. He said, besides this deterministic element, there is also element which is we can call it teleological. That's sort of looking into the future. That sometimes you make a mandala, and the mandala doesn't represent what you experience, but where you are going. The process is not yet finished. You have to actually have that experience in the future to understand retrospectively what that mandala meant. So we ask people to keep the mandalas, and then if they do additional work, they do Gestalt, or they have another session with holotropic breathwork, or they have a psychedelic session, or they have some powerful dreams. Frequently these future events retrospectively will illuminate something that they did not quite understand at the time when they were painting the mandala. So this is something that's similar to what you find in the theory of chaos, when you have a situation, a chaotic system that you cannot understand, but it's aiming to something in the future, which is called a strange attractor. And so the answer to that system is really in the future, not in the system itself. So there are also many different methods that you can use to help the integration of these experiences, whether they are psychedelic or holotropic. They complement this process in a very helpful way. So, for example, writing an account of the session can be very helpful, where you can get a lot of insights that you did not have before. Some people like to continue painting mandalas, maybe even a mandala every day. The other thing that you can do is when there is a lot of energy that was released, do good sport activity. Jogging, swimming is just a great complement. Body work, particularly body work with somebody who allows you to express emotions when they are working on your body that you don't expect to be silent. You can sort of let the process continue and complete itself. And there are all kinds of methods that are very good complements. For example, Fritz Perls' Gestalt therapy is great. Psychodrama of Jacob Moreno is great. The EMDR, Francine Shapiro, the rapid eye movements. Acupuncture could be a very good. If there are any residual blocks, it could be very good procedure, to help you with that. So those are all methods which are, we say, uncovering methods, as compared to the covering methods when you simply try to suppress the symptoms so that people are not bothered by them. But the symptomatic treatment doesn't really resolve anything. But this might be a more challenging process, but you have a chance to really find find some resolution. Now, I would like to say a few words about the results, the therapeutic results of the holotropic breathwork. Christina and I created the holotropic breathwork outside of the professional circles. We created it at SLN. It was not a situation like what I had in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, where we could get a follow-up, professional follow-up. We had a team who was working with us, and they saw the patients before and after, and then 6, 12, and 18 months follow-up, and we had funds for that, where we really got a very objective idea, you know, what happened to the patients. What we have here is quite a few studies that people whom we trained did as dissertation work, or even a small publication. There's also quite a few publications in Russia. Now, those that I'm talking about here, we have a list in our book on holotropic breathwork. Those were all people who did the training with us. In Russia, where the breathwork became very popular, there were a lot of people who were doing clinical studies and laboratory studies, but they were not people who were trained by us, but they were doing what they read in the books about what holotropic breathwork is. So we have a lot of informal reports. For example, every time we have a training, before the training, we go around the circle, and people, if they have already done breathwork before, they will share what impact it had on their life. And we quite impressive stories. We have seen people, you know, breaking out of depression sometimes in one session, as you saw it with this story of Gladys that I was describing in one of the earlier modules. We have people resolving phobias. We have people who, you know, very positively influenced their self-esteem or got rid of feelings of guilt. We have seen many instances where people got rid of, you know, quite difficult, painful body problems, muscular problems, you know, even things that looked like arthritis, chronic tensions and pains and so on. We have seen instances where people resolved even problems with diseases that would be considered medical problems. For example, at least 15 people who came into the training with Raynaud disease, which means there's a compromised circulation in the hands. They can't get their hands warm. And what turned out that those were the people who have the worst tetany in the session. They really get the carpal pedal spasm. But if they continue breathing, it kind of builds up until there is a resolution. There's a sense of warmth and flowing energy coming into the hands, and it opens the circulation. So behind the circulatory blockage, there was a bioenergetic blockage that can be released by the combination of breathing and the body work. We have seen quite a few instances where people got rid of psychogenic asthma, where actually the asthmatic symptoms come up when they start breathing, and we encourage them to express it with sounds and coughing and body movements, and we do the body work to help them, and you can completely clear the asthma this way. We have seen instances where people got rid of chronic infections in the sinuses, for example, in the pharynx, in the tonsils, in the bronchi, and also chronic cystitis. And what you see regularly that when people do the breath work, the major blockage would be in the area where they have repeated infections. So they are called infections because you find bacteria in there, but the problem is not infection. The problem is the poor circulation, which reduces the vitality of the tissues. The infections are not usually caused by any vicious bacteria. They are caused by bacteria which are normally there. But if the circulation is in order, then you get enough antibodies, you get lymphocytes, leukocytes, and so on. And these bacteria don't have a chance to grow. Whereas if you have compromised circulation, that means that the tissue cannot defend itself. So something that appears to be a medical problem, infection, really is ultimately an energetic problem and can be handled. We had some really sensational situation where there was a young woman who came from France, and she had Takayashi arteritis or Takayashi disease, which is a blockage of progressive blockage of arteries in the upper part of the body. So when she came into the training, she couldn't lift her arm above the horizontal, and she was losing pulse. And she went through a very dramatic process there with a lot of stuff happening, in her family, then difficult birth, and then some powerful past life experiences. And it started improving. So when she was leaving, the pulse was present, and she could move the hands. And we then had follow-up for a while, and this seemed to stay. I have lost contact with her, so I should again check what happened. But this is a disease that's progressive, and it's typically considered lethal. So if it could have any effect in these kinds of cases, that's certainly something that should be tried. So at the end, I would just to compare the work with holotropic states, specifically with the holotropic breathwork, with verbal therapies. So it has a lot to do with the fact that we found out in the work with holotropic states, as we discussed already in this program, that the deepest roots of various psychogenic emotional problems and psychosomatic problems are not just in childhood and infancy. They have these deep roots in the biological birth, and then further in the transpersonal level. Now, since this is the case, there is no way verbal therapy can influence these problems in any kind of a significant way. You cannot talk out birth. This has to be a very powerful experiential process in which you are allowed to make sounds. You have to be allowed to do the coughing to get rid of the constriction in the throat. You have to get body work to get rid of those blocked energies in the body. That there could be enormous amount of them from birth. And there could be also a contribution that comes from some a past life experience, or something that's coming from the transpersonal domain. So these are the limits of verbal therapy. It simply cannot reach there. It requires some kind of an intense experiential process. The other thing that you have to take into consideration, the verbal therapy is a very, very long process, and if changes happen, they are usually not really dramatic, something that would happen in the course of a day. Whereas if you work with these powerful experiential methods, psychedelics or the holotropic breathwork, sometimes changes can happen, radical changes in one day if the situation is somehow prepared in the dynamics between the unconscious and conscious. And you have no doubts, that the changes were related to the process that happened that day. And you find also the specific mechanism through which it happens. So this is a very, very important characteristic of these experiential techniques, that they are powerful enough to take you to the deep roots in the perinatal level and in the transpersonal level, where typically the verbal therapy cannot reach, unless it's a verbal therapy that changes into body therapy when the talking starts eliciting some kind of intense experiences. But kind of a traditional, orthodox psychoanalysis that I had, you were basically not allowed to do anything that would be dramatic. This was called acting out, sounds or body movements. So you were asked to basically talk in a very disciplined way. Now I know that there are changes now, but the methods that become effective, they have to take the body in to consideration in one or another way. The emotional problems are typically interconnected with the physical processes, and the advantage of these experiential methods is that they can engage the emotions, the psyche. They can engage the body, and they also have the power to take you to the spiritual domain, very much the way we discussed it in relation to some of the ancient or some of the native practices. So I hope that we would be able to, in the future, to organize some kind of a large-scale research that would involve, the kind of sophisticated follow-ups that we were able to do in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, where we had sufficient funds, and that we would be able to verify what at this point, it's a lot of sort of anecdotal stories of very remarkable things that happen to people that we hear, as I mentioned, before every module, and also in workshops that we are doing when people come repeatedly. So I will end here, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you next time.